So, good afternoon. Is it already afternoon? No, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, Welcome to our track titled Authentication Authorization. We have two sessions today, one big panel discussion and then two normal presentations afterwards. My name is Alexey Volagansky and my colleague here is Matthias Reinwart. We are both analysts at Kupping & Co. But of course, much more important are our distinguished guests today. And we have a very... Matthias?
I'm just closing the door.
Okay. So for our first panel discussion, we have four distinguished guests today. I guess no one in his room really does not know who these people are, but let's just follow the protocol and say we have Net Sakimura, a senior researcher at Nomura Research Institute, but also well known for his work for OpenID, Kantara, and other organizations. We have Stina Ehrensvár, CEO and founder at Ubicore. We have Anthony Nadelin, Chief Security Architect at Microsoft. And of course, Ian Glazer, Senior Director of Identity at Salesforce. So please welcome our guests to our improvised stage. This is going to be a panel discussion, so we expect them all. So before we begin, maybe we ask for, again, totally unnecessary, but let's follow the protocol, for a short introduction from each member of our panel. Just please tell us what you do and why you are here today.
All right, so I'm Nat Sakimura, senior researcher at Nomura Research Institute, the chairman of the board of the OpenID Foundation, one of the principal author of OpenID Connect, author of Auth Pixie, and all bunch of things, one of the founder of Kantara Initiative, working in the ISO for identity management privacy, so all sorts of, I've been doing this thing, the standardization, for over 15 years now. So looking forward to this panel.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Stina, CEO and founder of Ubico. Our company is a leading contributor to the FIDO U2F specifications, open authentication standards.
Thanks.
Ian Glazer, Senior Director of Identity at Salesforce. We have lots of users and want to get rid of their passwords.
Tony Nadlin, Microsoft, so I work on standards at Microsoft and have done quite a few standards in the past.
Great, thank you very much. Well, the topic for today, you can see it on the screen, the future of authentication stops waiting the password. It's actually very interesting. I think just last week, I think I've seen a very interesting, provocative tweet saying like after 10 years of working in identity and talking about password being dead real soon, we finally had a password day like last week, right? So passwords are probably here to stay, or are they not? It's up to you to tell us your opinions and then of course to engage with our audience in a discussion. And the first one to present is Net Sakimura. Please welcome.
Give him the...
Click. All right, thanks. So let's see, how does it work? This one? Yeah, all right. So why passwords are undead? Or it's a little bit old version, but doesn't matter. Okay. We know shared passwords are screwed. We knew that for, I don't know how many years now, like 20 years. And it's been declared dead for many times. Every year it's been declared dead for the last 10 years or so. But shared passwords are still the de facto standard for authentication. It's just like, it's just like they are undead or something like that. We've killed them so many times, but it's still not dead. So, when you think about the reason, you might just go to the developers, right? Like him. And I would say, why do you use password system? Then he would say, it's cheaper and easier, right? Then I'd ask, but usability sucks and cost of breaches, then he would reply that going to be paid by them, not us, right? That's negative externalities. Passwords are like air pollutions, right? And you know that these tools are all good, but factories didn't put filters till they were regulated. That means password is going to persist. There's a copy and paste here. I've pasted it twice. But likewise, password will persist unless some policy measures are put in place. So what kind of policy measures are there? For this kind of externality and market failure problems, there are three typical types of controls: quantitative control, tax, and compulsory insurance. Each of them has its merit and demerits. Quantitative control is easy to implement, apart from we really don't know what quantity is actually right. Tax is somewhat better because it would go through some kind of market mechanism, but still we don't know what the right tax rate is. And if we don't set the tax rate correct, it will cause market distortion. Compulsory insurance is very similar to tax, but it's a little bit better in that sense that the rate is going to go through the market mechanism. So I think that we should be looking more at the insurance in this kind of things. And that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to throw these options as discussion items too.
Looking forward to the feedback of the other participants, because you're actually trying to make them leave them alone. So
or should I say?
if you just click once, then we see who we thought would be next.
Some kind of intelligence test?
Okay, no, it should be.
Okay.
Should be. Sorry for that.
Okay.
Thank you. I take a little bit different approach than that, right? Passwords are very expensive to use. And if anybody's read the 2016 Verizon, data breach investigation report, you'll see that, 63% of the breaches happen because of passwords getting stolen. And so this winds up being a very expensive cost to both the relying parties and the consumers themselves. So it's the cost of account theft. The average cost in 2014 was $154 per consumer and about $30 to $60 per relying party to be able to restore that particular stolen account from a password theft. And today, what we see is a life without passwords, right? Today starts with platform support. So iOS has introduced Touch ID, right? Windows 10 has introduced Hello, and Android has gone with the FIDO U2F model. And so what this gives us is a chance to actually separate the authentication from the identity, right? Totally separate those things. Authentication is just a fact that it happens. You can attach identity at any given time. And today we have over 100 million users using Windows 10 without passwords, without them even knowing about it. So this is something that, can happen behind the scenes without anybody being involved. No user, has to go through a major reconfiguration of anything. When they get Windows 10, they have the option to go ahead and just use, cryptographic keys instead of passwords. And so also, this gives a chance for a big change in the industry, right? It gives us a chance to remove IDPs from the ecosystem, right? Because now we have the keys getting generated on the client side, and the keys wind up becoming the authentication mechanism for all the RPs. And so puts the user in control of federation, who they want to federate with. The relying parties can now set the policy of which clients or which users that it can accept into the system with the attestations that come from the various devices. If it's a Yubico key or if it's a TPM chip, it will understand where that authentication mechanism is actually coming from. And we'll have various trust frameworks in various governments to help mitigate some of this stuff. Thanks, Stina.
So now the click thing.
I have to say click? Is that
No, you have to say. Yeah, actually you do have. Just have to find out full screen mode. This looks.
Okay. Since I started my journey as a hardware authentication innovator, some people have said that software is the future. And my bank believed that too. They gave me a software authentication app. I happen to know a hacker who told me that it would take him about a day to write the code that would hack into my bank account and steal my money. To inform the bank about this risk, I called them up, and I got a very clear response on the other side of the line. Please tell your friend to not do that. So, there's been a lot of buzz around biometrics the last few years. And I was very curious to try it out on my new Nexus 5. But when I was going to set it up, a little text message popped up saying, using a fingerprint to unlock your device may be less secure than a strong password, PIN, or pattern. So we can't rely on static data. If you get a job at one of the big internet companies in Silicon Valley, you are likely to get a computer, a laptop, and inside the USB port, you'll get a small authentication key. But you may not know that it's there. And I learned that from a guy that I met at the local train on my way to San Francisco. I noticed the small golden edge on the side of his computer. When I thanked him for being a customer, he looked very surprised and said, "Oh, I didn't know. I thought that was the new Apple Touch feature." Yes! I mean, being mistaken for an Apple product is probably the highest achievement a strong two-factor authentication token can ever get. So what is the challenge? The challenge is, how do I get these keys to work everywhere? On every service, on every application, just seamlessly, with a simple touch, no more hassle, with great security and great privacy. And, I mean, I know a guy in New York, and he told me that he can identify the bankers working at Wall Street by the size of their pockets, because they have these huge keychains with tokens, and that cannot be the future. So what is the future? Just like our friend Tony told us, it's standards. Open standards built in directly into platforms and browsers. Three really important building blocks of those standards are FIDO2F, work that is now being done in W3C, and Openly Connect. Combining something you know, or are, like a PIN, or a password, or biometrics, or location, or something that is not very secure but additional factor, to hardware authentication that is natively supported in computing devices that you buy, in phones, in computers, but also into small keys like the YubiKey. And I'm very optimistic about the future. Thank you.
I got one of these. I need that. All right. I have no idea what's in this. Oh, right. Okay. So, speaking from an enterprise of 17 some odd thousand people with a whole bunch of stuff, rolling out authentication services internally becomes a really interesting experiment for a lot of different things. And so one of the things that we observe is, both internally and out, killing the password isn't a technical problem anymore. In that, we have all of the plumbing pieces that I think we need as an industry to achieve this, right? That we have not only a variety of different, whether it's hardware factors or even if it's software, we have all of the technical integration capabilities that any enterprise could go on and start to kill their passwords. The problem is, at least from a technical perspective, the problem is this is a cultural problem. Passwords are a cultural and problem of habit, because we've had umpteen decades of 2 boxes. Username goes here, password goes here. And we've been habituated to doing this, and we have trained our users to do this. So when Google, for example, changes their login screen for Google Apps so that just as username, you would have thought the sky was falling. People freaked out because they were expecting to see username, password, and all they got was username. So you talk to the folks at Google and they'll tell you their support lines lit up, like, you're broken. What happened to the other field? And the change, even though it was actually a much more secure change, what happened culturally broke things, broke people's habits. So when we talk about how we move on to something else, to me it's not so much about the technology involved, it's actually about the cultural shift that occurs. There's another little problem here. This one may actually be technical, which is, we know you want to have at least 2 factors, or at least we sort of think that's the right thing. There's 2 things that have to be presented. But not every factor is equal. The problem is we also don't know how they're not equal. We don't really have good science on, if I add this kind of modality for authentication to what I already have, how much more secure am I? The whole conversation gets really weird because we don't actually have much science around it. So you start getting into these scenarios where, well, yes, we collected a biometric, but the biometric unlocked a small entropy PIN, and that key material didn't necessarily, and all of a sudden you're in this really tough conversation about how much am I loading up on the user because we think it's more secure, quote unquote, and yet we don't have any data to prove that we're doing it. So there's this interesting problem about factors and how we select them, both from a usability perspective, security perspective, and changing people's habits. Let's start the conversation.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your introductions. I guess I'll ask the first question because I have the microphone. As Ian just mentioned, passwords are definitely not a technical problem because we really, for years, have all the components for a solution. Hardware, software, standards, and even worse, people actually hate passwords. I mean, if it's a habit, it's a very unhealthy habit, like smoking. So how do we actually fight this habit? Do we have to introduce like anti-password laws? Do we have to run some public awareness campaigns, or?
Let me get, since I got the mic, I'll go first. But you mentioned smoking. Like, there's the answer, right? If you want to get people off of passwords, charge them for using passwords. It goes to Nat's point about externalities. Absolutely. We charge people to use passwords like we charge people to use longer extended support on Windows XP, let's say. Right? You want to do a behavior that is extraordinary. We use economic factors to move off of it, and we use the money from that to mitigate the risk to both ourselves as a service provider and our neighbors.
So you'll notice that this is the first time that the W3C has actually taken on a new web authentication besides basic authentication. So this is a big movement for W3C to endorse, not moving to passwords. So we burned into all the browsers and all the platforms, and this is the start of how this is going to happen. It may not necessarily be a full tax on people, but when somebody logs on to Windows, they can use a PIN, and that's going back to your usability factor. They're still entering something, but that PIN only is a gesture to unlock the TPM chip, which then generates the keys. And and authenticate you, so no passwords are actually flowing anywhere. And so you don't get into the account theft issue of hacking into a server and stealing the passwords out.
Is there a generic distinction between using passwords, username and passwords in an enterprise environment and as a user on the internet, as a public user, as a consumer, as a customer? Do you see a dividing line? Or should enterprises actually really be fined with taxes, with insurances, which is much more difficult for us as the end user of users of services, of subscribers to Netflix? I don't know.
I mean, you don't want, or at least I don't think you would want, two different ways to do things. If I'm like, just like when you use a credit card, you don't want to have something different for your corporate credit card versus your personal credit card, right? So, I think this all applies to, both consumer and enterprise users.
So we need a solution for both.
Yeah, they're looking for strong authentication. They have hackers at their doors all the time too, so it's no different.
So I think that now when the building blocks are starting to be in place, the first thing will happen is that a lot of the big online services will start marketing security as, we have good security, come to us. It's going to be a market feature, just like Volvo, who invented the seatbelt. They got brand recognition, we got good security, and they drove the open standard, and when you think about Volvo, you think about security. The next thing will happen, just like the seatbelt, there will be regulations and law putting on, but that's going to come later. So I think it will take some years before it comes, but it's not going to be too long because the problem is so big. So I think that you started saying it's been broken now for 20 years, and we've been talking about it, but I can see that things are going to happen really quick this year and the coming couple of years.
Yeah, so I think the industry leaders, like Volvo in your example, will lead. I mean, the Windows Hello thing is the first authentication system that my wife actually can use, right? Just going in front of it and it works, right? She had even problems with the 4-digit pins because she's having different pins everywhere and she doesn't remember which one, right? So I'm full confidence. I've got full confidence that industry leaders are going to be shifting to that. The problem is that people who's going to be the sites and the applications who's going to be lagging behind. And many of them don't have too much incentives to secure the things. So, some kind of regulatory or measures, non-technical measures, which could push them towards having something like that. Just like in the car, you had the regulation to put the seat belts, right? Would actually help us a lot.
Correct. I got the point that you mentioned that security is marketed as a pro for a company, to really say this is a good thing, we're securing your data, and this is something that really speaks to me as a user, as a consumer. But I don't think that I see enough companies actually doing this. I see it with my phone, which is much more secure than most of the enterprise accounts that I use. So this was the question behind the reason for the question, is there a dividing line between business and outside? Because I assume that some systems in the internet are much more secure than we are used to it from our corporate environments. And are there other incentives apart from making them do it?
I mean, there's a simple risk mitigation calculation, right? Holding a bag of passwords is holding a bag of toxic waste. Now, there's some of us who have to do that, right? But we invest enormous resource in doing it as safely as possible. But not every service provider is going to make that investment or is capable of making the investment. And so then they're left with risk. So their investors, their board, their executives, you should be thinking about this as a risk calculation of saying, if we get away from passwords, now that there are great alternatives that are both usable and more secure, if we can actually get away from passwords, we actually reduce overall risk to us as a provider. And that's a very straightforward calculation. However, it takes courage to break the culture that we've already established, breaking a norm. So that's why Google was frankly quite courageous to change the way their login screen works, because we're breaking a norm. But they knew, wow, we're reducing our risk. Any company can be in this position. You've got to commit to, look, I'm going to reduce this risk by changing and breaking a norm.
But, just getting rid of passwords is a very difficult problem, right? Because you have protocols such as POP, SMTP that require passwords. Those protocols have to get changed. You also have the issue of bearer tokens, right? Today, you can have a very strong authentication that happens. That cookie gets dropped on that server, and say goodbye. No matter what authentication you've done, that cookie's gone at this point. Somebody's hijacked it and gone. So it is a multi-tiered problem that we have to solve. It's not just moving to a cryptographic operation for authentication. We have to look at the different pieces involved in this. Either that or we've done not much good.
Yeah, and just as I was imagining a great solution, like you have to add a third field into your login form. Username, password, and credit card number. But unfortunately, the problem seems to be a little bit more complicated, so yeah.
I just want to add a comment on sort of the investment, because we talk about, is this a big investment? If you're not one of the major cloud companies, can you make your own investment? I see the future will be just like we do today with Facebook Connect. Those who doesn't, want to store passwords, they can offload it to someone else. I think that's a model that will happen. The big identity providers who have built-in good, strong security will be identity providers for those who can take the investment. Also, the community that are building these standards, we are trying to make them as affordable and simple as possible. So there's already open source servers out there that you can implement. To implement FIDO2F, it takes less than a day from one intern. We heard that from one company who made support for it, and then the rest is free. I mean, it's not like you have to go to an IBM and get $100,000 investment to make it done. And I think those are the core pieces, make it open and simple for anyone to implement.
But if it's easy to implement, if it's just a bad habit from users, shouldn't we just educate, make people understand what security means, what a password is, that it is bad, that they should not use it, that they should select the right services?
Yes, yes, we definitely need to educate users.
Is this
just
enough?
like you go to India, you don't, eat the salad and drink the water because you may get a disease. That's the kind of education you need to learn.
Okay.
Going on the internet without security, cautious and learning about the options is I think there needs to be a lot investments in education in the coming years.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
It's like a public hygiene education thing, but I'll have to point out that one thing which is the most difficult is to change the people.
That was my question. Is educate enough?
Education is...
If I tell my daughters, 2 daughters, 16, 20, if I tell them, don't use this service because it's just username password and it's going through your iPhone and you don't know if it's encrypted even. They don't care. And they're my daughters.
Right. Yeah, right? And also about the risk calculation. So, one startups, I happened to talk to a bunch of startups as I was sitting in one of the committees for Ministry of Economy back in Japan. When you're talking with those startups, they really don't care the security property or privacy property at all, right? I tell them that the risk of breach is going to be huge, that you might disappear if you don't do it right. But then they said, well, we need a speed. We need a speed. Unless we do it like this, with a speed, we'll be disappearing before we finish implementing things. Also, if something like the higher security stuff requires consumers or their customers to change their habit, they are really afraid of it. It's going to be a huge risk for them.
But still, the scare tactics do not work. We know that from an anti-smoking campaign, Even if you put a huge picture of cancerous lungs on the cigarette box, it just doesn't work, it doesn't help.
And how do you depict fraud?
Right. So we went through this user experience. We went through what we call UBI, which is out-of-the-box experience with Windows 10, right? To get people by default to use the cryptographic operations for generating the authentication mechanisms. And so we had to think about how to present that to the user so that they would select that option, because passwords are still an option on Windows 10. And so we've gone through some of that and taken some of the results back. It is possible, and so 100 million users have now switched over without any issue. So that's a start on getting people to move away from passwords without even knowing it.
Do you publish the result?
No.
You should.
Yes, you should.
That will get us a long way.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. If presenting someone a choice to change their behavior versus having no choice in the sense of it's not a conscious thing I have to do, it just is so much easier to go this other route. So that's why, touch on a phone is a great example of this thing. Like, I don't necessarily think about anything other than the expedience at which I can get to the thing I want to get to. So as opposed to talking about it as, user, if you don't choose this, horrible things will happen to you, versus it's just an experience, it's part of my experience to use the thing I want to use, and it's very natural. That's how you make that change. So for a startup, you can start doing the right thing, right? You can drop U2F in a day and go do that. But if you have a non-greenfield environment where you have 10 gazillion users where it's like, okay, and now tomorrow we're going to change the login screen, like cities will burn, right? People freak out. So it's how do you make that experiential aspect of it so simple that it isn't a choice per se? George.
Really, two questions. One of them, have we solved the delegation problem across all software? Because half the time you have people sharing passwords is because they want their admin to be able to get into their email and their calendar and their whatever else, right? So it seems like we have, from a cultural perspective, to your point, Ian, that's something that I would like to hear some thoughts about. In regards to people sharing IDPs, like not doing identity themselves, from my experience, we solved federated authentication. We haven't solved federated life cycle management, right? So there's a whole bunch of other problems. So either of those, I'm interested in your thoughts.
So on the delegation issue, right? So what we're attempting to do here is to separate out, authentication from identity itself, right? And so the authentication is just a fact that happens, and you verify that happened. It's up to the relying party to associate whatever attributes it wants with that, including any authorization attributes for back-end delegation and using some of the OAuth stuff that we're all working on as far as work for whatever we want to call it. And so I do believe that that's a progression that we're going to see coming down the line.
Tony, you might want to define what is identity, because
identity is whatever the relying party wants to do, right? So it's going to vary, and that's why we wanted to separate out the authentication piece.
Set of attributes, set of claims, right?
Yes, set of claims, set of attributes. And we also wanted to make sure that we carried along the metadata from the authentication so the relying party has enough information that it came from this YubiKey with this firmware rev, and it was a push button YubiKey, not a normal YubiKey, not a finger swipe YubiKey and stuff like this. So RPs will have a much richer way to do. Yes.
Well, we have to solve the delegation problem. We have to solve the delegation problem for IoT, right? So you think it's bad with your secretary wants access to your calendar. Well, when it's a variety of other non-sentient beings that want access to different resources, we have to solve that delegation problem. But to your point around federated provisioning, we tried to do this once, Tony, and it didn't work out so well. No, your point is very valid, which is there's a cadence that each provider has for the life cycle of its individuals or its things. There's the plumbing problem, which I think we can get to solving, and I think Skim v2 actually is a pretty good way to do that. The problem is there's that cadence difference so that you have a business process impedance mismatch, essentially. And that's where things get messy. And I think actually we probably won't use Skim for that. We're going to use just-in-time provisioning and then have short-lived delegated authorization so that we don't have to deprovision, essentially. We just let the token age out. Just a guess. You're loud enough. Come on.
Sorry.
I don't know if it's being recorded.
It is.
Okay, so then I should use the mic. I guess I also think about use cases like, something happens to my federated IDP that I'm using, and how do users get into my service? Or how do we train users to, create 3 identity providers that they all link to a single account at the RP? There's a whole bunch of those kinds of use cases that from an industry we have not addressed from a best practice perspective, which makes it very difficult for a relying party, a startup, to say, I'm not going to do identity at all, and I'm going to outsource it.
Do you want to respond to that?
It's also like the practices of, what do you mean that my fail-safe phone number is not supposed to be the phone number that I use for my SMS authentication? It's all of those overloading issues as well we have to address.
I want to change the aspect to another direction, because when you speak to any IT responsible in a company, everybody knows that the 2-factor authentication would be the best, to have something and to know something. But why is they are not changing? The problem is the rollout of these gadgets you need for authentication. Because for a smaller company, like 100 people, it's no problem. But to personalize these gadgets for 200,000 people is really a problem. And you also had bright processes, what you do when people had forgotten their gadget for authentication and must have something else, otherwise you had to send him back home when he had forgotten his gadgets. It's not possible normally. So for me, it's the costs for rollout, and I do not think that it can change it so easily. And I think it's also not necessary to do that for all people in the company. When a worker, for example, at BMW, apply for a holiday, I think he needs no 2-factor authentication. Their password is still okay for me. Do you have any experience with this or any proposal to solve the problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of edge cases and error cases, right, that we had to look at when we're trying to roll out this in Windows 10, that, people forget their devices, they lose their devices, how do you bootstrap a new device, and how do you authorize a new device, since I may want to use a personal phone versus a work phone, and I want to be able to authorize, I want to be able to generate the keys on either of these devices to be able to use for authentication purposes. And, I'm sure we haven't covered all the cases, but, we went through quite a few of these error cases trying to make sure that recovery is no harder than, I hate to say this, but, no harder than password recovery, right? Costs a lot less, but it's not going to be, we're not going to put people through a much tougher process than forgetting your password. And so it's going to be a learning curve on how to take care of the error cases. And, we're just getting a start of it. And I believe that, as most of the people on the panel have said, it's going to take a little while, but it's definitely, on the way. And, maybe we'll take a checkpoint next year this time to
we will be killing the password next year. Yeah, sure.
And the next year and the next year.
Sure.
In terms of rollout, a couple of years ago, we rolled out second factor to the entire company in 3 days. 17,000 people, 3 days. 17,000. We over-communicated, we had practically daily warnings coming to people like, this is coming, here's the education. So for us, the effort was about 60 days of communication from IT, from management, to everyone saying, this is what's coming, this is the experience, this is what you're going to do. And then a lot of pizza and well-staffed help desks, and in 3 days, effectively, we had somewhere on the order of 90% registration and use. There were some people that were on long-term leave, vacation, we didn't get in. But for the most part, I think the number is less than 500 people out of 17,000. We got on second factor in about a week's effort. So it can be done, but the hard part is not getting the tokens, seeding them, and distributing them. It is making sure that the culture is ready for the change and that you over-communicate that as a rollout. And the same would be, well, actually, when we deploy YubiKey, right? We have a lot of comms around, this is your Aloha key, and this is what you use it for, and everyone gets them when they come to the company. But it's about the communication of the cultural change more than, this is the technical aspect of it.
Somebody else? There was a question in the audience.
I'm accepting that at a desktop-based browser environment, it's pretty easy to roll out a second factor or multi-factor, whatever. But in my company, for example, I'm addressed by users telling me, okay, I would like to have a specific Wi-Fi password on my mobile device. I don't trust it to store the company password, but I have to store one because logging into Wi-Fi using multi-factor authentication on a mobile device, which is expected to log in without user interaction, so Exchange can perform active sync, update my calendar, remind me of upcoming events. Oh, and accessing Exchange using multi-factor from a mobile device. Wow, it's... didn't you say technical issues and plumbing are done? Doesn't feel to me like that. So do we wait for legacy systems like active sync to disappear or whatever?
And so, yeah, so the technical issues are not all solved. There's some basic ones solved, but as I said, you still have, all the various protocols that depend on passwords, SMTP, POP, Wi-Fi, radius, yes. So we still have those issues to solve. So we do have some basic technology that most of the industry leaders have agreed upon as far as the cryptography is concerned, and how that payload looks. It's going to be now getting into, working on the other protocols to get them to be able to use this cryptographic protocol. And it's going to take, as I said, it's going to take a while to get everything, but, if we can get at least, all the users that use their primary website to get off using passwords, I think we've made a large accomplishment. And what we'll have is these edge cases left to wind up to be solved.
This isn't binary, right? Actually, the realization, it really isn't about killing the password. It's, we jokingly talk about it as just not really bury them very far down in the ground. What we want to do is diminish the frequency of use of passwords as a first step. We would like to diminish the importance of the password as a first step. But going from 0 to, yep, no one uses that and everything is second factor and there's no password anymore is completely unrealistic. But we can, in our own ways, in our own enterprises, diminish the frequency, if nothing else. Start there. And that leads to more things that you can start to do. But we set unreasonable goals, I think, otherwise.
I actually think that a simple PIN is a very good second factor to something more secure. I don't see the necessity of killing it, but it is that simple extra factor. And it's not going to be stored in big databases that can be hacked. It's going to be taken care. It's local.
Yeah, it's just like data minimization, password minimization, right? That's what we are at.
Right. There's another question in the audience.
Yes, I think Anthony said something very interesting. He said it's a multi-tier problem. Let's assume that everybody is using YubiKey for authentication, and that's very secure. But at the end of the day, or we have a cookie, a session cookie, we have an access token, and we have iOS, we have browser, which try to protect these credentials. And the question is, how much should we invest on the authentication to keep the same level as actually the current operating systems, the current browser settings are capable to protect the credentials?
So, when we've been working on this issue for a while, and we realized this, you can increase authentication to, very high levels, but the cookie or whatever you have gets dropped. And so we've looked at this, and as part of our effort in the standards bodies, we're pushing for token binding in IETF. And so this is going to bind all the cookies or any cookie that you want, or token, or whatever blob that you have. It's going to bind it to the HTTPS session. And so, you get that bang for the buck there. If somebody picks up that cookie and tries to use it on a different session, it's not going to be able to. The keys aren't correct. And so we're trying to make this seamless, right, to get Android, Windows, iOS to pick this up so that you don't even notice that it's happening behind the scenes. It's all in the SSL stack. You don't do anything for this extra binding to happen. Yes.
Yeah, cookie and other bearer tokens are another password, right?
Yeah.
And we are trying to kill it. Right. Yeah.
Right, so okay, to wrap it, at least this part of the discussion up, is we're trying to kill the password by starving it, by making it less important, by making its use less frequent. And you mentioned in the beginning, and I love this statement, to apply regulatory measures towards the use of passwords. And I'm still trying to find out what is a good way to actually achieve this. And because we all said it's a bad habit, it's still there, it's cheap, others are relying for the breach costs, and really what can we actually take away for all of us here to understand what we can do to make this more secure, to avoid the password as far as possible.
So from the regulatory point of view, think of password as personal data, right? Breach of it will have consequences per GDPR, right? And you probably want to to buy insurance policy for something like that. But the price of the insurance is going to depend on what you implement.
Okay.
Right? So that's one way of doing this.
Stina?
I can see service providers actually giving their users an incentive by saying, this is the cost of our service. If you have good security, if you choose the good security option that we have, we will charge less.
Okay.
We charge less, and I think that's going to be very good, because money talks. If I go in and if I'm using Salesforce, and instead of having to pay, just an example, a lot of money, and then a little less money, then I'll probably take that option, and then I'll tell my team, my company, say, everyone, we need to save money. We're going to go for that option. And everyone is a winner in that scenario.
Yeah, but that's actually a change in paradigm. Currently, when I want to be more secure, I have to go to Amazon, spend $5 and have a YubiKey. $5 or more.
Yeah, but that's a little money compared to the rest.
Over the number of times you cross it, it's cheap.
That's true.
Absolutely, it's nothing.
But to convince, it's easy. Yeah. We are a special kind of people in this room.
And there will be free software eventually, and it will be things inbuilt in computers. You go and buy, chips directly integrated in your phone, your next phone or computer. So it's not only, everyone is not going to come to me and buy my product, even if that would be cool, Okay.
So, it's going to come down to the, how this gets used. You got to make it dirt simple for people to use this. I've seen some numbers on, iPhones and how many people are using Touch ID and things like that, and it's remarkably high compared to using the PIN or anything else that you have on your iPhone, because it's built in, it's simple, they swipe their finger. It's going to be the same way with devices. Some devices will have built-in chips, TPM chips, so you're not going to go out and buy one. But if you want to have it mobile, depending on your use case, you're going to get an external authenticator and be able to move that around. So, as everybody here said, it's going to be the usability of these new logon screens or these new ways to authenticate.
I just want to emphasize it's all about usability. And I think that this, the effort that we're doing will eventually get into payments too. So you don't have to retype stupid, passwords, credit card numbers. The same, cryptographic protocols could be used for payment in the browser. It could be used for IoT. It could be used for a lot of things that will just seamlessly be there. It's a bright new future.
Okay, and if I ask the audience, from your point of view, do you think that, or who is of the opinion that making the user experience better is a good way to start, or what would be a good start from your point of view? First of all, who thinks user experience and improving it is a good option to improve security? I will ask afterwards how to do that. Okay, and actually, are there suggestions what you're seeing in your practice? I know there are people from very large corporations in that room, and there are people from smaller corporations in the room. What do you do to improve, on the one hand, security, and on the other hand, user experience for your customer, or for your employees, customers, to make things better? Is there somebody who dares to answer? Oh, sorry, I come back to you. Sorry for that, I come back.
I missed some part of this session, so maybe this is discussed before, so forgive me if I repeat that again here. So we have our environment. What I think is user is, we are calling as staff only, or external collaborators also, because this experience we are talking about here is for staff, internal users, but are we considering other collaborators who are exchanging information with us? Our systems, they log into as extranet, intranet part. Are we considering that? Because that won't help much if we go with this type of experience.
Absolutely, because those collaborators tend to have some of the most sensitive access in the enterprise. So if you're not issuing second and third and possibly just dedicated hardware to those people, that's an unnecessary risk.
So part of this is making sure that, if you've got a managed device, that you're getting the attestations from the devices back, so that you can make that decision that, what type of device it is, and if you issued it, or what the firmware level is, et cetera. You can now have rich authentication policy on your relying party, which you couldn't do before.
The comments? Okay, then.
I had a very general question or comment. One of the issues about killing passwords or not killing passwords is that passwords can be reset. You can't reset a fingerprint information or biometrics if the information is stolen from my device.
Right.
So what's the solution for that?
So the approach that we've taken is that we have things that we call gestures. Gestures could be a PIN, gestures could be your fingerprint, etc. They are just there to unlock the actual cryptographic operation. So they unlock the TPM chip. The TPM chip actually generates the cryptographic keys and stores the cryptographic keys. Since TPMs are supposed to be tamper-proof, they go through their own certification process, etc. So yes, if you can have multiple gestures on a Windows device, you can set it to a PIN, you can set it to a fingerprint. So if you forget your PIN, you can swipe your finger. If you forget your finger in the morning, you can use your PIN, etc. So I don't see any. And so, there's going to be no difference from passwords.
Yeah, but what if someone has stolen your finger in the morning?
You're watching the wrong films.
You can remove. Right, so you can remove. You can test for liveness. I think what we have is what we just demonstrated was Microsoft produces a device called a band, and it's it's like a Fitbit but better. And we demonstrated that and we did the authentication to Windows Hello. And if you have a band and you have it on your wrist, we can test for liveness. And if you take the band off and set it right next to the computer, it's not gonna log you on. You have to have it on a wearable thing. And this will increase as technology increases, that you'll be able to do all sorts of things. I mean, we demonstrated it. I can't. No, my manager's here, so he can.
Okay, So one more question, then I will wrap it up.
So, Tony, I guess it seems to me the point you made earlier about separating authentication from identity would answer the question that we had before, which is I can revoke that set of keys against that particular identity and force the user through a new process. So I think there is a revocation mechanism even in what you've done.
Okay, great. So before we convene next year and still kill the password, maybe to wrap this session up, what would all of the four of you recommend, actually actionable, real results that people could take away to make sure that there are less passwords available next time we meet? What would be your suggestions? Who wants to start?
Move to Windows 10 and use and use Hello. And our phones actually have infrared cameras on them also, so you get the whole package here.
Okay, thank you.
Federate with all of your service providers. Start there, right? Let's get SSO involved and start federating with your service providers. Then roll out two-factor mobile out-of-band to everyone in your enterprise. That's the next step.
Make support for FIDO U2F.
More or less the same. With the but federation is now cheap. Just do it now.
Great.
It's a first step.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you.